Hello and welcome to the Class 16 video on social biases and generalizations. In this unit, we've been looking at how to reason with generalizations. We looked at how to make generalizations. We looked at how to make inferences about individuals based on generalizations. And we looked at the idea of a correlation. In the previous class, we looked at some general cognitive biases that cause us to reason badly with generalizations. In this class, we're going to look specifically at social biases, biases related to social groups or identity groups, and how they affect our ability to reason with generalizations. For the reading, we returned to Maureen Linker. We saw her earlier writing on intellectual empathy, so I'd like to begin by reviewing that. Intellectual empathy is the core concept for Linker's book, and it continues to be important in the sections that cover cognitive bias, which we read. This is how Linker introduces intellectual empathy. I use the term intellectual empathy for the work we will be doing in this book because it captures the cognitive affective elements of thinking about identity and social difference. I mentioned in the previous class on Linker that intellectual empathy is a fairly common term in critical thinking, but Linker's approach to it is a little bit distinctive because it unifies both the cognitive and the affective, or to put it in more simple terms, the thinking and the feeling. Other treatments of intellectual empathy rely too much on the cognitive thinking side and not the affective, the feeling side. And that can be a real problem. As I said before, a lot of this can be summarized in a tweet, which I found really inspiring. If you say you don't allow your emotions to influence your thinking, you're saying you have absolutely no awareness of all the ways emotions influence your thinking. This is parallel to our basic message about cognitive bias. If you say you aren't affected by cognitive bias, you are really just saying you aren't aware of all the ways your thinking is affected by cognitive bias. In general, I think the approach of the critical thinker shouldn't be to move beyond emotion or to overcome emotion. We just want to apply the same metacognitive skills we apply to our reasoning to our emotions. So the goal isn't to be unemotional. The goal is to be emotionally intelligent. Your emotional intelligence will complement your argumentative intelligence and make you a better critical thinker. All this applies to the notion of intellectual empathy. One example of the way intellectual empathy has traditionally been treated comes from the philosopher Richard Paul, who has done a lot to promote the teaching of critical thinking together with his partner, Linda Elder. When Paul discusses intellectual empathy, he emphasizes two skills: the ability to charitably reconstruct someone's reasons for belief, and the ability to reason from premises you don't agree with. And these are great. They're both on the cognitive, the thinking side of things. We can complement this with a view of intellectual empathy with some ideas from Linker. Linker adds two ideas. Understanding how someone's beliefs are situated in their web of belief, and understanding their emotional motivations for their belief. Let me review the idea of web of belief in case you've forgotten. Web of belief is an analogy from the philosopher W.V.O. Quine. He said that our beliefs form a web, like a spider web. The beliefs are the nodes on the spider web, and the threads that connect them are inferences, because there are inferential connections between all our beliefs. So our beliefs are united by an argumentative structure. They're connected by inference. This means that if you alter one, it's going to have reverberations across the whole web of belief. Beliefs in the center of our web of belief are harder to revise than beliefs around the edges. This is in part because they have more inferential connections to the other parts of the web of belief. Also, as I said before, beliefs that relate to our self-conception are almost always the most deeply held. These include beliefs about the identity groups we belong to, things like race and gender. So your idea of what it means to be a man is going to be at the center of your web of belief in all likelihood if you identify as male. Another part of what keeps the center of our belief strong is another idea that we've discussed before, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is just the tendency to ignore or discount evidence and arguments that contradict your current beliefs. A standard example here is how people choose news sources that are slanted toward their current belief. We'll talk about this more when we talk about information filtering and echo chambers. Confirmation bias is a global phenomenon. It applies to all your perceptions. Everything is filtered in a way that maximizes your ability to confirm what you already think is true. Confirmation bias relates to the web of belief because confirmation bias works to keep the center of the web of belief strong. Confirmation bias is like a maintenance procedure for your web of belief that ensures that things you think are central stay central. Changes only come, if they come at all, to the periphery of your web of belief. If you get disconfirming evidence, if something unexpected happens to you, if you are predicting things go a certain way and they don't, you are going to try to account for that by making adjustments to the edge of your web of belief. That's easier for you. Confirmation bias, which has been running all along the whole time, has built up defenses for the ideas at the center of your web of belief. So let's go back to intellectual empathy. Linker added two ideas to the conception of intellectual empathy: understanding the location of someone's beliefs in their web of belief, and understanding their emotional motivations for their belief. So this brings in more of the more of the affective side, the cognitive affective understanding. You have to understand someone's emotional motivations, not just their cognitive motivations. And you also have to think about them holistically as a person. You have to understand their web of belief and where what you're talking about sits in their web of belief. So I said that for this class, we would use a combination definition of intellectual empathy that brings together elements of both Richard Paul's definition and Maureen Linker's definition. So broadly, I say that intellectual empathy is the ability to holistically understand the person you're reasoning with. I say holistically here to capture both the cognitive elements Paul emphasizes and the affective elements that Linker emphasizes. So intellectual empathy requires charitably reconstructing someone's reasons for belief, being able to reason from premises you don't agree with, understanding how their beliefs are situated in their web of belief, and understanding their emotional motivations for their belief. So now we can go back to Linker. Linker, for the reading today, talked about various social biases that impact that impact our ability to be critical thinkers. And all of these, in the end, relate back to failures of intellectual empathy. So I'm just going to run through the list here. Actor-observer bias, status quo biases. She just says status quo bias, but I'm going to expand on it a bit to include several variations of status quo bias. And then a whole bunch of biases that are related to group identities. So in-group bias, group polarization, the out-group homogeneity effect, false consensus bias, the hostile media effect. So let's start by talking about actor-observer bias. So the first one is actor-observer bias. This is our tendency to feel that our own actions are products of our particular circumstances, while the actions of others are viewed as signs of their basic character. So I got caught in traffic, but you are irresponsible and have no respect for other people's time. So in some ways, this is a fairly familiar idea. People just make apologies for themselves and blame others. But there's a specific pattern that's being followed here. It has to do with internal and external causes. My actions were determined by things outside my control, things outside of me. Your actions come from your character. I'll return to this. But Linker gives a quote that I think is good. And she quotes a lot from online debates, and I think this is a good thing to do because again, if there's one place in the world that could use more critical thinking, it's online debates. Um, so here's the online comment. I am a single mother, and when my daughter was little, I decided to go back to school to earn my nursing degree. I was in a tough situation financially, so I applied for food stamps. I used them for a time, but I got off them once I could earn a decent living. Most of these people today, though, on food stamps just want a free handout and they expect everyone else to take care of them. Notice the pattern here. She had to go on food stamps because she was in a tough situation. Circumstances dictate action. Other people, their actions, including going on food stamps, come from their basic character and wanting a free handout. So again, here's an old Peanuts cartoon that I like. Linus says, why are you always so anxious to criticize me? Lucy, I think I just have a knack for seeing other people's faults. Well, what about your own faults? I have a knack for overlooking them. So the issue isn't just that we fault other people, but overlook faults in ourselves. There's a specific mechanism that lets us do this, really. We specifically say, my actions come from the environment and your actions come from your character. And some of this is self-serving. Some of this is also just a product of having our own perspective. Um, we know the factors that go into our decision making, right? In the previous slide, the woman knows why she went on food stamps. She remembers the situation. So when you remember your particular circumstances, you think about the external stuff. On the other hand, when you think about other people, you don't know their situation as well because you're not in their situation. So you blame it on their character, the one thing that you do know. Okay. So next I want to talk about the status quo biases. And I'm going to talk about three specific forms of status quo biases: loss aversion, the endowment effect, and the just world hypothesis. To understand these, I want to look at the umbrella term that I'm using for all of them first: status quo bias. Status quo bias is just a preference for keeping the things the way they are now. And this is actually a global bias that happens to people, whether they identify as politically liberal or politically conservative. People actually don't like change for the most part. Change bad. To illustrate all the different ways humans tend to think change bad, I want to discuss a survey I do in the in-person version of this class. I'm not doing the survey online, so you don't get the fun of playing along. I'll just explain the results to you, and now I'm going to cut to something I recorded earlier, so my hoodie is going to change. Basically, what happens is everyone is given a piece of paper with two choices on it, option A and option B. And for everyone, the two choices are mathematically the same. Option A gives you a sure outcome. At the end of the experiment, you have $1,500. Option B involves a risk. At the end of the experiment, you have a 50% chance of having $2,000 and a 50% chance of having $1,000. So everyone has two options and they're mathematically the same. I should note that under economic models of rationality, the way economists assume people behave when they behave rationally, you should be indifferent between these two outcomes, actually. Because the way you understand the value of an outcome in economics is to multiply the dollar value of it happening times the chance of it happening. So in option B, you've got 50% chance of 2,000, that's 1,000. 50% chance of 1,000 is 500. So it adds up to 1,500. So according to the economists, you should be equally likely you should be indifferent between these two options. But actually, that's not the way most people behave. Most people prefer sure outcomes to unsure outcomes and therefore choose option A. However, there are situations where people's preferences get reversed. And so I said that everyone in the class had the same two options, but the options are only the same mathematically. In some cases, the options are worded one way, and in another case, they're worded another. So actually, in the first scenario, the first version of the two options, everything is phrased as a gain. So in option A is someone gives you, on top of anything else you own, $1,500. And option B is someone gives you, on top of everything else you own, either $1,000 or $2,000. The second kind of survey people got, option B is turned into a loss. So what happens is option I'm sorry, the options are phrased as losses. So for option A, you get $2,000 and then 500 is taken away. And then for option B, you get $2,000 and either no money is taken away or $1,000 is taken away. So suddenly people's attitudes change. That is, if you just are talking about how much money you get for free, people are risk averse. People do not take risks for gains. However, all you have to do is give something and then say you're going to take it back. Suddenly things are phrased as a loss. People will take risks to avoid losses. So again, the two versions of this choice are mathematically identical. One is phrased in terms of gains and one is phrased in terms of losses. And what happens is when it's phrased in terms of losses, people switch from being risk averse to being risk seeking, right? Or at least open to risk. So I don't have numbers to put in here, but I will just make some up. So I think the way it worked is in the in-person class, everyone who got scenario one chose option A. And I think maybe there were 6 people there. So everyone chooses option A because people are risk averse. Naturally, in normal circumstances, you're risk averse. That's just a standard way to be. But in scenario 2, where things are suddenly framed as losses, people's behavior changes, and some people are now open to taking a risk, right? So it was like 4 and 2, maybe. The point is, again, situations that are mathematically identical can yield different results depending upon how the question is worded. So here again is the summary from the Southworth and Swoyer textbook. People are risk averse when it comes to potential gains. People are risk seekers, or at least more open to risk, when it comes to losses. And it's important to note that this has real-world consequences. So Southworth and Sawyer reference a study where radiologists are given descriptions of two kinds of treatment: radiation therapy or surgery. This is for a hypothetical lung cancer case. And in half the cases, the description was framed in terms of the cumulative probability of living longer than a given time frame, that is, gains. In the other half of the cases, it was framed in terms of dying within that span, losses. Um, and so the same effect occurs. People preferred radiation therapy 78% of the time when it was done in terms of surviving, but only 58% of the time when it was done in terms of mortality. And these are doctors. These are people who are making decisions about people's lives, or at least coaching them in decisions about their lives. So what we're looking at here is a version of the framing effect. And we saw the framing effect earlier in the section on memory. There we said that the framing effect meant that the wording of a question can affect the way something is remembered. So when we were discussing memory, we pointed out that asking someone how long was the movie will get slightly different answers than asking how short was the movie. So this is the framing effect in memory. We can now see the framing effect in decision making. The wording we use to describe our choices affects how we make those choices. Options in terms of avoiding losses are preferred over the same options when phrased as a gain. So we're actually looking at the intersection of several different effects here. One, there's a framing effect, but what the different wordings of the framing influence are two other cognitive biases. One is loss aversion. A loss of a given size seems bigger than a gain of the same size. So in scenario B, you are activating people's sense of loss aversion, and that overcomes their normal status, which is risk aversion. So there's a classic experiment by Kahneman and Tversky where subjects are either given a free mug or free chocolate or nothing. So I love these experiments where they just give you stuff. Come on in, undergraduates, have some chocolate, have a mug, or nothing. They're then given the opportunity to trade for something else. And even though you were given whatever you were given, it was random. People who got nothing, people generally chose to keep what they got first. So people who got chocolate decided that they liked chocolate. People who got a coffee mug decided, because they got it, that they would prefer a coffee mug. And then there was this weird thing where people who chose nothing had a slight bias towards choosing the mug. I would emphasize that a lot of the more extreme results from this research, because it got really, really trendy for a long time there, and some of the stuff hasn't replicated. So I'm assuming that things like people with a bias, people who got nothing having a bias towards a mug is just noise. There's a lot of noise in this research, and we're just trying to focus in on a few things that we know are for real. Risk aversion, framing effect, and loss aversion are all very real. Sometimes loss aversion gets specifically labeled the endowment effect. And this is because we're now specifically thinking about cases where you're given something, endowment. So this is a cognitive bias that causes us to value things we have more than we would value the same thing if someone else had it, right? So we require more money to sell something than we would pay if we were buying the exact same thing. All right. Status quo bias can lead to something called the just world hypothesis. And this is just the belief that, on the whole, life is fair. Things turn out basically the way they should. And this is important because it's the underlying psychology behind victim blaming. So this was researched for many years by a psychologist named Melvin Lerner, who then summarized it in a book called Belief in a Just World, A Fundamental Delusion. So I want to dig down on this because victim blaming is a real and dangerous phenomenon. So people will love to say, life isn't fair. Who told you life is fair? But people's attitudes towards victims suggest that they do think life is fair. People really don't like to think that bad things can happen to good people for no reason. So when something bad happens to someone, there, there's a strong urge in a lot of people out there to ask, what did they do to deserve it? And so one prominent place where this kind of victim blaming comes up is sexual assault cases, where it combines with misogyny and patriarchy to make people think that the woman who was a victim of sexual assault actually did something to deserve it. She led the guy on, or she was promiscuous or something. But this isn't just limited to cases of sexual assault. Another place it comes up is with police violence. If an unarmed black man is shot by the police, the tendency to victim blame combines with racist background assumptions to again make us ask, what did he deserve? What did he do to deserve it? Um, so really, when people say life isn't fair, first of all, I've only noticed people say, "Who told you life is fair?" when something bad is happening to someone else and they're trying to get you to stop complaining. But even then, people don't really believe it because, uh, again, they actually think that for the most part, bad things happen to bad people. If something bad happened to you, you must have deserved it. And this gets built into the structure of all kinds of religions. Um, there are lots of folk beliefs that say, if a baby is born with a disability, the family must be cursed. Doctrines of karma in Indian religions are sometimes used to victim blame. Um, there are branches of Christianity where wealth is taken as a sign that you are blessed by God, and poverty is taken as a sign that you are in the thrall of the devil, or you're cursed, or you're lazy. This is especially true these days of the prosperity gospel, but it has roots in 19th century Christianity. And so this kind of victim blaming is a broad human tendency. Um, and I buy the theory that it comes from fear, right? Um, we all think we're good people, basically. And if bad things can happen to good people for no reason, then bad things can happen to us. We don't want to believe that bad things can happen to us, so we seek explanations when bad things happen to people that attempt to explain why they actually deserve it. So the just world hypothesis is a version of status quo bias that leads to victim blaming. It's a very important psychological phenomenon that you need to be careful of as a critical thinker, right? And also as a moral thinker. So this actually comes up this has come up in my own life in an interesting way, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I want to emphasize it anyway. This is a field guide I was reading for activists looking to combat bullying against queer and gender nonconforming kids in schools. And both of my kids are queer and or gender nonconforming. And so I became active in trying the movement to try to protect them. Popular Comms is a group that gives communications advice for people who want to spread a message, in this case, an anti-bullying message. And here's something that they gave in one of their reports that really struck me. Under the heading, What to Avoid, they said, avoid introducing vulnerable and targeted students as victims first. It's not fair, but psychologists have long recognized a common tendency to blame victims rather than sympathize with them. And in the longer version of this report, they actually do specifically cite Melvin Lerner's research. So the good news is that the simple act of first establishing individuals as protagonists with goals, for instance, a student who has a dream about their future, and then introducing how something or someone is threatening or stopping them, increases empathy and invites perspective taking. So it's weird, but if you say, this legislation about trans youth is going to lead to trans kids being bullied, that is not an effective talking point because people will switch to victim blaming mode. But if you tell a story about a kid, oh, and she just wants to go to college. She wants to study music in college. She plays violin. You introduce her as a protagonist first, and then introduce the bad thing that happens. But because of bullying, she attempted suicide. Now the audience sympathizes. This is, I would say this is both kind of callous and irrational. This is a callous and irrational part of human thinking, that we don't automatically sympathize with victims, but it's right there. And the way around it is actually to tell stories differently. So unlike a lot of critical thinking, this isn't so much combating a bad emotional tendency with a pure rational tendency, which rarely works anyway. It's actually combating a bad emotional tendency with a good emotional tendency. And all of this gets back to the fundamental lesson that I've been trying to emphasize in this course, that the secret to dealing with emotion in critical thinking is not to try to bury emotion or to be non-emotional, but to use the same metacognitive skills you bring to rationality to your emotion. So be emotionally intelligent. Emotional intelligence reinforces cognitive intelligence. So we've talked about actor-observer bias and the status quo biases. All the remaining biases can be grouped together because they relate to identity groups or social groups. So the last section of this video is just on the group-based biases, and we're going to start by talking about in-group bias. A lot of our discussion here will use the technical terms in-group and out-group. And these might be fairly self-explanatory, right? In-group just means us, out-group means them. And this allows us to talk generically about all sorts of divisions that come up between people, race, nationality, religion, ethnicity, gender, all these things, right? And so part of having an in-group and an out-group is bias against the out-group. That's straightforward prejudice, right? We don't like people of that other race. We don't like those foreigners. Straightforward prejudice, straightforward racism, it's easy to understand. There's a flip side to this that people tend to discount, and that's in-group bias, a general preference for other people who are members of the group we identify with. It's not so much that we hate them, it's just that we like us. And so this could be a big factor, for instance, in employment discrimination. Oh, it's not that I disliked the minority candidate. I just hit it off so well with the candidate who was just like me. And we know this can lead to problems. I mean, obviously, economic injustice between races and other groups, but also just the fact that if you get a whole bunch of people together and they all think the same way, there are certain kinds of errors you can fall into. And having a diverse group of people can make you a better group of critical thinkers. So there's a quote here from Marilyn Brewer, a social psychologist that I like, that Linker gives. Ultimately, many forms of discrimination and bias may not be because outgroups are hated, but because positive emotions such as admiration, sympathy, and trust are reserved for the in-group. Okay, so there are two I want to cover at the same time because actually Linker has an example that hits both of them. One is group polarization. This is the way our beliefs and attitudes can become more extreme and more rigidified in the presence of members of our social group. So if you're together with a bunch of people who you're in church, so you're all the same religion and you're all the same sect of the same religion. Actually, you'll start trying to one up each other on being, oh, the most Jesus or the most enlightened or whatever, right? The other is the outgroup homogeneity effect. This is the tendency to see all the members of the outgroup as alike and interchangeable and even expendable, while viewing the in-group as made up of diverse individuals. Um, so Linker illustrates these two with an online conversation that features two people who are extremely pro-gun and one person who is a gun skeptic, a skeptic of the ability to use guns to solve problems. And what happens is the two pro-gun people begin one-upping each other on how great they think guns are. Um, and as this happens, the other person gets more skeptical of them and specifically says, all you Second Amendment types are all the same, right? Um, so what's going on here? It's not just that um, we polarize. There are factors driving polarization that are actually built into the way we think. So the outgroup homogeneity effect is pretty natural, once again, just as a result of having a particular perspective. Um, you know your group really well. And you know all the people in it, and you know the differences between them. Often the fights that you have between members of your group get really heated because they're intimate, right? Um, Meanwhile, you don't know much about the other guys, so they all start to seem the same. I saw a meme going around that said, um, uh, people who turn right wing because they're annoyed by left wingers are weak. No one is more annoyed by left wingers than other left wingers. And I'm certain the same meme could be circulated on the other side as well, because uh, of the outgroup homogeneity effect and these factors that drive group polarization. All right, two more. False consensus bias. We often, if we're not contrasting our own group with an outgroup that we distrust, we tend to imagine that everyone is actually just like us. So this is the cognitive bias that occurs when we overestimate how much people agree with our beliefs, values, opinions, preferences, how much their experiences are like ours. I find at LCCC, I encounter a lot of situations where people have very radically different levels of computer literacy. It's a factor that happens a lot at community college. And people just walk in, some people will walk in assuming that everyone is super computer literate because they grew up in a home with lots of computers. But not everyone lived that life, right? And so they're actually, things are different. So, we uh, if we're not demonizing the other, we're just imagining everyone is the same as ourselves, and that also is a dangerous cognitive bias. Okay, the last term I have here isn't from Linker, but I wanted to introduce it as a general term that covers a lot of stuff that we've been talking about, and this is identity protective cognition. These are patterns of self-deception and faulty thinking that come from our need to preserve our self-understanding. You need to protect your sense of self, which includes not admitting you're wrong. So this is an umbrella category that covers a lot of the cognitive biases that we've seen in the section, and it ultimately relates back to the web of belief and confirmation bias. Identity protective cognition is another name for the factors that keep the center of our web of beliefs strong. So that's the last of our section on generalizations. Next up, we have the practice test and then test 3.